It began on the edge of the Sagrean expanse, where the stars grow quiet and even the vacuum feels ancient. I was stationed aboard the Whispers of Harmony, a Unity-class observation vessel designed for first contact missions. As a Zalari, I was trained for this, reading the signs, predicting cultural behaviors, assessing threats or opportunities with surgical detachment. 27 successful contact events under my belt. 27 species evaluated and either integrated, quarantined, or ignored. I thought I'd seen everything. Then we found Earth. The signals were our first warning. Not language in the traditional sense, but a flood, no, a barrage, of digital chaos. Audio, video, encoded light pulses from a blue and green world spinning around a G-type star. We ran the usual protocols. First, scan for structure, patterns, repetition, anything that might suggest intentional transmission. What we got back was bizarre. One channel was broadcasting a figure in painted grease screaming into a microphone about something called WrestleMania. Another showed colored creatures teaching children shapes through song. One feed played a grainy film where a human strangled another over a ring of metal they called a precious. But between the madness were glimpses of brilliance. Mathematical constants, artistic compositions, theoretical physics, and a strange but elegant symmetry in their languages. The species was fractured, volatile, and contradictory. They were primitive in some areas, wildly advanced in others. Drones were dispatched to orbit under stealth protocols. The images they returned made me pause. Their cities glittered at night, glowing with inefficient energy but radiant in their own way. Their landscapes bore scars of wars, yet teemed with life. Their skies were full of machines, flying craft, satellites, even debris from past ventures. But the real shock came from one particular clip, a crude rocket, belching flame, climbing out of their atmosphere. They called it Apollo. We played the footage over and over. A being, soft, fleshy, oxygen-breathing, stepping out onto another celestial body. They had left their cradle. Not with sleek technology or unity of purpose, but through stubborn will, trial, and sacrifice. Their first steps were unsteady, but undeniable. They launched themselves to the moon using chemical combustion, my assistant, Veril, whispered. No gravitic assist. No inertia damper. No planetary sling. They could have died, I replied. But they didn't. That was the moment it started. The unease. The dissonance between what our models expected and what the Terrans delivered. This wasn't a species slowly ascending toward enlightenment. This was a species that broke the rules. Bent reality to its needs. Took risks not for survival, but because the void dared them not to. I filed my initial report that cycle. I remember the last line clearly. Asterisk, humanity has entered the interstellar arena. Not prepared, not invited, just arrived. Asterisk. And the galaxy would never be the same. We called it the simulation fallacy. A deeply rooted belief within the galactic concord that civilizations capable of imagining their own extinction were inherently self-limiting. If a species could foresee its downfall, it would alter course, stabilize, evolve slowly and cautiously. Earth tore that theory to pieces. After preliminary scans, we began deep cultural extraction, sifting through their global networks, decoding their languages, cataloging their media. We expected data. What we found was something else entirely. A torrent of self-made realities, trillions of words and images, thousands of years of storytelling compressed into digital veins running through copper and glass. They didn't just tell stories. They created entire worlds. Simulated civilizations built inside machines no larger than a ration cube. Programs they called games, films, and shows. Fictional empires, wars across galaxies, disasters that wiped out whole planets, and in every one of them, a Terran stood at the center. Bleeding. Fighting. Dying. Surviving. One simulation called Mass Effect detailed a future where humanity faced extinction at the hands of synthetic beings. Another, The Last of Us, told of a fungal plague devouring civilization. There was Metro 2033, Fallout, Children of Men, each narrative darker than the last. Our xenopsychologists were alarmed. They're obsessed with their own annihilation, Veril said, scrolling through yet another apocalyptic archive. No, I corrected, they're obsessed with resisting it. Because in every one of those simulations, no matter how bleak, how hopeless, there was always a spark. A single Terran rising against the tide. Sometimes they lost. More often, they simply endured. That, more than anything, shook us. I watched one simulation personally. A series they called Interstellar. The science was inaccurate, but the emotion, the desperate yearning to save one species, to find meaning in the vast cold emptiness, was real. Terrifyingly real. It echoed something I had never seen in any other species, a refusal to accept their cosmic insignificance. Their stories weren't escapes. They were rehearsals. Rehearsals for catastrophe. Rehearsals for loss. Rehearsals for sacrifice. And yet, they laughed too. Their humor was strange, sarcastic, dark, irreverent. They made jokes about the end of the world. They turned existential terror into memes and late-night comedy. One Terran stood in front of a camera and spoke about nuclear annihilation with a smile, calling it Tuesday's problem. We didn't understand. Not at first. They weren't afraid of fear. They made fear familiar. That was the flaw in our models. We assumed fear would paralyze. But for humans, fear was fuel. It drove them forward. Every nightmare scenario they imagined didn't stop them, it trained them. They dreamed of their own extinction so they could learn how to survive it. The simulation fallacy wasn't just wrong. It was dangerously naive. And in that realization, I felt the first chill of something deeper, something ancient, that lived within the Terran psyche. They were not preparing for peace. They were preparing for war. Our first attempt at contact was a disaster. Not because of a miscalculation in translation or intent, but because we underestimated their culture, specifically, their obsession with humor. We transmitted a formal greeting in 27 Earth languages, accompanied by a visual representation of our delegation and a peace offering in the form of universal mathematical constants. Within 20 minutes, the message had been intercepted, copied, and uploaded to something they called Reddit. Within an hour, it had been transformed into a meme. A popular Earth comment read, "Bro looks like a squid got into my Wi-Fi router and tried to propose." The rest followed suit. Our ship's graceful, bioluminescent form, a pride of Zalari engineering, was dubbed the Galactic Calamari Cruiser. A user named Salty Socrates 42 photoshopped our ambassador wearing a cowboy hat and wielding a plasma lasso. It was absurd. It was infuriating. But it was also revealing. You see, most civilizations we encountered approached first contact with reverence, even fear. Terrans. They laughed. And then they asked us if we wanted to collab. We regrouped, confused but committed. The United Earth Council, if such a thing could even be called unified, refused to send their head of state or a diplomat to meet us. Instead, they offered a representative more in line with their cultural interface standards, a man named Marcus Tran, better known to Earth's digital community as Internet Historian. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a soldier. He was, apparently, a storyteller. He arrived late, wearing a hoodie with a cartoon dog on it and a badge that read, "Hello, I believe in aliens." When we tried to initiate a standard greeting sequence, he interrupted us. "You guys don't have coffee, do you?" he asked. "You really should fix that. Can't have a meeting without coffee." Despite every warning from our cultural analysts, we allowed the meeting to proceed. And that's when everything changed. Marcus didn't ask about technology or alliances. He asked about our myths, our stories. He told us about Earth's religions, then about sitcoms, about the moon landing, and then about a cat who played piano on YouTube. He explained that Earth didn't have one voice, it had billions. That unity was a myth, but consensus? Consensus was their magic trick. "You're looking for logic," he said, sipping from a thermos shaped like a penguin. "But humanity isn't about logic. It's about pattern recognition, emotional chaos, and telling jokes in the face of death." We didn't know how to respond. But somewhere deep in our databanks, the models began to shift. This wasn't just noise. It was armor. Their memes, their jokes, their sarcasm, it was a cultural immune system. A way to deflect fear, to confront the unknown without being consumed by it. We left that meeting not with answers, but with something else, the unsettling sense that humanity had seen the abyss long before we arrived, and they'd learned how to laugh inside it. We requested access to their historical archives. They didn't hesitate. They opened everything: public databases, museums, documentaries, personal footage, even things they weren't proud of. It overwhelmed us. Centuries of war, colonization, slavery, nuclear brinkmanship, and genocide, all recorded with unflinching clarity. No redactions. No sanitized versions. The truth, raw and brutal, laid bare. Our kind typically shields painful history behind ceremonial walls. But the Terrans, they displayed it in public squares, taught it in schools, debated it openly in forums. They built memorials not to glorify the victors, but to remember the victims. I stood in one such place, Hiroshima, and saw a child's melted lunchbox encased in glass. Just a small tin container. But the silence around it was deafening. Why display this? I asked the guide, a quiet woman with gray eyes. So we don't forget what we're capable of, she said. So we don't pretend we're better than we are. It rattled me. Even more unsettling was the consistency of this pattern. Rwanda, Cambodia, Armenia, the Holodomor, the Holocaust. Entire empires rising on blood, collapsing into ash. And yet, after each collapse, humanity rebuilt, not as if they forgot, but as if they had to remember. As if memory itself was a weapon against repeating the horror. And they carried their pain forward, not as shame, but as fuel. I met a young girl in Kiev who was learning cello in an underground metro tunnel turned bomb shelter. When I asked her why, she smiled and said, "Because they bombed the music school." Simple, defiant, unshaken. That was humanity's true power. Not their technology, which lagged behind most galactic standards. Not their biology, fragile and short-lived. Not even their creativity, which was erratic and unpredictable. No, it was something deeper. Something older. Scar tissue. Their entire species was built from it. Not just the physical kind, but cultural, generational, psychological. And it made them hard to kill. We analyzed their disasters, natural and man-made. Famine, plague, war, climate collapse, economic ruin. Over and over, we saw the same response. They mourned, they argued, they blamed, and then they adapted. No other species we'd encountered did this with such frequency or fury. Their stories were filled with broken heroes. Flawed saviors. Rebels, not messiahs. They didn't ascend from peace. They crawled from rubble. I remember watching footage of first responders during the 9/11 attacks, humans running toward a collapsing building to save strangers. It defied logic. Survival instinct said run. But Terrans ran into the fire. They didn't do it because it was strategic. They did it because it was right. That day, I submitted a second report. A simple update to my original assessment. Asterisk, humanity's strength lies not in avoiding the fall, but in choosing to rise after it. Again and again. With bloodied hands and unshakable will. This species remembers everything, and survives anyway. Asterisk. And for the first time in my long life, I felt small. And humbled. The warning came from one of our junior analysts, a quiet Teverari hybrid named Lilex, whose specialty was speculative behavior modeling. He had been combing through Terran media archives, compiling a risk profile on their potential response to interstellar threats. What he found disturbed him so much he refused to submit it through normal channels. Instead, he brought it directly to me, eyes wide, hands trembling. They prepare for extinction, he said, voice brittle. Constantly. Obsessively. I reviewed his data. At first, I thought it was just more of the same. Fictional disasters, imagined invasions, artificial fears played out in digital stagecraft. But this was different. These weren't passive entertainments. These were psychological war drills. He showed me simulations called Skynet, I Am Legend, 28 Days Later, and The Walking Dead, scenarios where civilization collapses and Terrans must survive with dwindling resources, facing both monstrous threats and each other. I dismissed them at first, until I saw the underlying patterns. Every scenario was different, but one constant remained: humans survived. Not always as heroes. Sometimes as desperate animals. sometimes as villains. But they lived. They lived through zombie viruses, AI uprisings, alien exterminators, even planetary annihilation. Their storytellers didn't just imagine apocalypse, they lived in it, emotionally. Trained for it. Some even built real-world contingencies, underground bunkers, prepper communities, manuals on surviving total infrastructure collapse. This wasn't fantasy. It was rehearsal. And then came the real shock. In their simulations, they were the monsters, too. They imagined themselves as the villains, as the AI that exterminated its creators, the empire that enslaved others, the plague that wiped out worlds. They explored their own darkest impulses not with fear, but curiosity. No other species in the Concord dared do that. Most repressed their inner savagery. Humanity studied it like an organism under glass. And they didn't flinch. That's what truly unsettled me. They knew what they were capable of. Knew the monster in the mirror. And instead of destroying it, they gave it voice, shape, and purpose. They told stories about redemption, yes, but more often, stories about failure, survival, and endurance in spite of that failure. They didn't see themselves as perfect. They saw themselves as unfinished. I asked Lilex what it all meant. It means, he said slowly, that they're ready for the worst. Not because they hope to prevent it, but because they assume it will happen. And when it does, they'll already have imagined how to live through it. I looked back at the faces in their simulations, dirty, scarred, determined. Terrans standing against alien invasions with homemade weapons, fighting machines with sticks and fire, sacrificing everything for a sliver of hope. This wasn't fear. This was muscle memory. We had long believed that the greatest danger in the galaxy would come from without, something ancient, powerful, and hostile. We were wrong. The most terrifying force in the galaxy was already here. And it was human. The council chamber was quiet, an unnatural, strained kind of silence, like the moment before a predator pounces. Representatives from over 400 sentient species sat in rigid posture, eyes fixed on the holographic image hovering above the center of the hall. Earth. A world both beautiful and brutal, spinning calmly in space, completely unaware of what today meant. The vote was simple in structure, historic in consequence. Should humanity be granted observer status within the Unified Species Council? Not full membership. Not yet. Just a seat at the edge of the fire. I had been chosen to speak. Me. Rulvik. A Zalari who had never doubted protocol, who had always trusted in the great consensus of civilized logic. And now, I stood before a tribunal of the most advanced minds in the galaxy, preparing to argue for the inclusion of the most unpredictable, volatile, resilient species we had ever encountered. I began with data. A mistake in hindsight. Their technological advancement was erratic, impressive in certain areas like information systems and theoretical physics, yet primitive in others, such as waste management and atmospheric control. Their biology was fragile, inefficient. Their societies were fractured, divided by culture, economy, faith, and something they called history, which they carried like scars on the skin of time. I could feel the council's skepticism rising. So I changed course. I told them about the little girl playing cello underground as missiles fell overhead. I told them about the men and women who ran into fire and rubble during their catastrophes, not for glory, but because someone had to. I showed them images from the Voyager probes, ancient by Terran standards, still sailing through space, carrying messages of hope, music, greetings, and a golden disk etched with the dreams of a planet that hadn't yet met the stars. A bottle, flung into the cosmic ocean, hoping someone, anyone, would answer. I saw a few heads tilt in curiosity. Then I showed them Hiroshima, and Kigali, and Aleppo. I showed them the worst of humanity, because they never hid it. And then I showed how they learned from it. How they remembered. How they rebuilt. How they taught their children not to forget. I told them of their endless arguments, their refusal to agree even on basic truths. Yet somehow, beneath the noise, a deeper pattern, growth. Not linear. Not smooth. But undeniable. They are not like us, I concluded. They are not harmonious. They are not consistent. They are not safe. But they are worthy. The silence returned. Then came the tally. Votes flickered across the chamber. Most were slow. A few came fast. I watched the count build, unsure of which way it would lean. For a moment, it stalled, tied. And then, with a single blink from the Illyrian delegate, the scale tipped. Passed. By one vote. Humanity had been given a seat. The chamber buzzed with soft murmurs. Warnings. Predictions of chaos. I understood their fear. Because they were right. Humanity would change everything. I live among them now. Not because of duty, not as an observer, but because something in me changed. Earth was supposed to be just another assignment. A cultural anomaly to be documented and filed. But it became something else, a gravitational pull I couldn't escape, not with engines or reason or rank. My apartment is in a city they call Chicago. It's loud, restless, filled with contradictions, glass towers and crumbling brick, neon lights and quiet prayer halls, artists on street corners and billionaires in mirrored offices. Every morning I sit in a small diner owned by a man named Elias, a former soldier with more scars than stories. He brings me burnt coffee in a cracked mug and never asks why my skin shimmers or my eyes reflect light differently. Here, I'm not Ralvek, the Zalari envoy. I'm just Ray. I watch them. Not as a diplomat, but as a witness. A child on the train giving up her seat for an old woman. A street performer singing through the rain with no audience but pigeons. A group of teenagers arguing about whether artificial intelligence should have voting rights in their online game. They're impossible. Inconsistent. Incredibly human. Sometimes I walk past their museums, their libraries, their places of remembrance. The Smithsonian. The 9/11 Memorial. The National Museum of African American History. Each one a wound kept open, not to bleed, but to breathe. They choose to remember. Not just their triumphs, but their failures. Their shame. Their mistakes. Because they believe something sacred lives in the telling of it. One evening, I stood in front of a classroom of young humans. I was invited by a professor who believed his students should hear from someone who'd seen the stars. I told them about the other civilizations. The ones who achieved balance. The ones who never knew war. The ones who burned too bright and vanished. And then I told them the truth. None of them were like humanity. A girl raised her hand and asked, "Are we dangerous?" I paused. Then nodded. Yes. Terribly. Another student leaned forward. Then why let us in? I smiled. Because you're dangerous to stagnation. To silence. To indifference. You break things, sometimes even yourselves, but in doing so, you move. You grow. They didn't cheer. They didn't laugh. They just nodded, as if they already knew. I don't know what future they'll carve into the stars. I don't know if it will be peaceful or turbulent or something the galaxy has never seen before. But I know it will be theirs. Because humanity doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't follow the map. It makes its own. In all my travels, across all the known systems, I have never met a species more volatile, more brilliant, more painfully self-aware. And I have never met one more determined to matter. The galaxy will learn this truth the hard way, or the hopeful way. Either way, it will learn. Because the most peculiar species is no longer watching from the dark. It's here.